really cool Facebook. A couple people had it, and it was really just kind of really relevant to kind of some of the events that are happening. America had this great victory in the eyes of some, and yet some really smart people kind of reminded us that our response ought to be different. So America successfully, in their eyes, kind of killed Osama, and you probably saw it on a couple of people's Facebook, is the quote from Martin Luther King. And it says, "I mourn the loss of thousands of precious lives, but I will not rejoice in the death of one, not even an enemy. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And I typically don't like to do kind of housekeeping stuff beforehand, but I thought it was kind of necessary to kind of remind us that as Christians we have to have a different response and a different attitude to some of the kind of things that are going on in our world today. So we've kind of come to an interesting point at 657 here. How long has it been, Pastor True? 2 years in Revelation, about that. So we finally kind of run out of chapters in Revelation, and we've kind of come to a close on that. I'm so grateful that we've been able to go through that, and we ought to give a lot of thanks to Pastor Trudy, because that is definitely by far one of the hardest books to understand, and on top of that try to explain to others, so kudos to that. One of the big mistakes we can kind of make after going through such a deep book of the Bible, and one that's so relevant to our lives, is just forget about it after. And so we aren't going to be revisiting Revelation, but we are going to kind of do some sort of follow-up, and tonight we're going to call our message that. So we're finished Revelation. Now what?
Finish.
Finish. It is finished. No. One of the biggest mistakes, before we dive right in, one of the biggest mistakes we can make when approaching worship, especially a worship service, is coming in with a bad understanding of worship and a bad view of worship. We use it in the way we talk. We say things like, "Oh, worship was great," or "worship was kind of dead." And what we mean by that is people were responding, or they didn't play the songs I like, or they didn't have enough fast songs, or some craziness like that. And we have this kind of weird, distorted view of worship. There was Soren Kierkegaard, who was a Christian philosopher, a theologian, an author who loved psychology. He lived in the 1800s, and he likened the realm of worship to a theater and a performance. Emily Brink writes this to kind of summarize his contributions to our understanding of worship in the Christian faith. She says this: "Imagine a worship service as a drama. Who's the audience? Who are the actors? At first glance, most would say that the congregation is the audience, and the minister, or the worship team in our case, are the actors. But no, Kierkegaard supposedly claims that God is the audience, and the worshipers are the actors, and the minister is a prompter." I didn't know what that was until I looked it up. The idea that Kierkegaard is getting at is that worship is not something that we receive from the people on the stage, but that in a weird way we almost are the ones giving that. And I don't want to say performance because it's not something fake, but it's something very real. But we're giving the show, or we're giving the action to God, and so that's what Kierkegaard kind of sets up. And so in this kind of frame, in this kind of picture that he sets up of almost an opera house, where you have dancers and singers, and you have the audience, who is God really, who's sitting in the seats. The minister is the prompter, and basically the prompter is basically this person who would kind of sit in a box around here, and you wouldn't be able to see me. I'd literally just be facing the stage, and the job of the prompter was to kind of sing the melody or remind the actors and the singers of the lines as they got on stage, just so they didn't forget right when they got on. And so similarly, as I'm kind of growing in my understanding of worship and worship as a whole, as a congregation, I'm sort of seeing that the message plays that prompter role, and that the message is simply a reminder of what the lines are and how we're supposed to sing it, and the actions that we're supposed to be doing on that stage of just really worshiping God. And so coming out of Revelation, it's almost like we've gone through this very, very long script, and it becomes very, very easy at this point to forget all of the lines that we're supposed to sing. And so just like I said before, we're not really revisiting it, but we are going to walk through two parables that are really going to kind of summarize how we ought to live in spite of the coming of Christ. And so before I read, actually I'm not even going to read the scripture, you guys are going to read the scripture. I'm going to put you guys into two groups, and I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes, only 5 minutes, and you guys are actually going to act out the two parables. Alright, so I'm trying to think of...
Wrong side.
Alright, we'll just go left and right, and you don't have to use everybody, because that might be really hard. But do you guys have a Bible on this side? Do you guys have a Bible on this side? Yeah? Alright, so you guys are going to do Matthew 25, and it's the first parable, the parable of the 10 virgins. So, and I don't see 10 women there, so some guys are going to have to step up in. Alright, and you guys are going to have Matthew 25, and it's the second parable, the parable of the talents, or the gold coins, or however your translation puts it. So I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes, only 5 minutes, and when you guys present it, you guys are going to come up on stage, and someone's going to have to read the passage, either as it's going on, or whatever. I'll let you guys figure it out. So, have fun.
He called together his servants and gave them money to invest for him while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of gold to one, 2 bags of gold to another, and 1 bag of gold to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities, and then left on his trip. The servant who received the 5 bags of gold began immediately to invest the money, and soon doubled it. The servant with 2 bags of gold also went to work and doubled the money. But the servant who received 1 bag of gold dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money for safekeeping. After a long time, their master returned from his trip and called them to give them an account of how they had used those money. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of gold said, "Sir, you gave me 5, I doubled it." Ish, like that. So the master was full of praise. "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount. So now I will give you more responsibility. Let's celebrate together." Next came the servant who had received the 2 bags of gold and went to report, "Sir, you gave me 2 bags of gold to invest, and I doubled the amount." All the masters were happy. And then the guy with 1 bag, "Sir, you're a hard man. Harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I was going to lose your money, so I hid it in here." The master replied, "You're wicked lazy."
Whoa.
At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 of them were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some oil, or our lamps are going out."
My torch is dead.
No. There may not be enough for both of us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourself. But while they were on their way, To buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived.
What's up?
The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. Sir, sir, they said, open the door for us. But he replied, I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour.
Let's look at about 10 versions, 10, not versions, not upgrades, virgins. Alright, so one of the central messages in the Christian church, in the Christian faith, in the church, throughout history, ever since Christ rose from the dead and ascended to heaven, is this, that he is coming back. Now the wedding in the story is completely different and very different than a wedding that we would have here in North America. Weddings in Palestine were completely different, and the people who originally heard this, it just would have clicked. It would have been like really easy to understand. Whereas the idea of shutting the doors and all that stuff, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. In our society, we send out invitations, we book a hall, we book a church, and people show up, and that's pretty much it. But in the culture of the story, wrapped up in ancient like Palestine and Jerusalem and such, a wedding was a community event. The couples, after the whole wedding ceremony and such, which lasted a week, by the way, they would actually march home, and they would take the long way home. And as they were marching home, people would just like parade behind them, and people would just like drop their laundry and go and just join the parade and such like that. It was just really, really, really different from what we would do. And the whole idea was that you wanted to treat the couple like royalty. So we just had this kind of royal wedding. And if you can imagine, everyone that has a wedding would just be treated like prince and princesses. And they might actually even be called that in that whole week of that wedding celebration. So during the week of the wedding, there was a number of festivals that would happen throughout the week, and it was really only chosen friends and family that were invited to come. But the interesting thing is that once you were there, you were kind of there. You didn't really leave. You didn't really go back home and do some chores and come back. Like, you were there. And the other interesting thing is when the door was shut, the door was shut. So, I mean, I know it seems like every culture says their culture is late. Like West Indians are like, oh, we run a West Indian time. But then I have Korean friends where they're like, we run a Korean time. I'm like, what? And they all have the same. So anyway, lateness would not be tolerated. When the door was shut, the door was shut. But the coolest part about the Palestinian wedding was this. You don't exactly know when it is. See, the idea is that the bride and the bridal party are just kind of in waiting, in expectation. They don't really know when it's going to happen, and they're just kind of anticipating it. And so it was customary that the groom would even come in the middle of the night, just so he would be completely unexpected. And it was almost like a game where you're trying to kind of surprise, and so literally the whole wedding is just like has to be ready to go at a moment's notice. But upon arriving into the town, the groom would actually send a messenger and say, hey, like, the bridegroom is coming. So all that's just kind of laid out in Scripture, and that's exactly how it would have actually happened. And so the lamps become important because one of the other rules in the culture is that no one is allowed outside without a lamp. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. I guess the danger stuff and all that jazz. And so to have a lamp without oil was just kind of to really be unprepared and to be kind of lackadaisical about the whole thing. Is that a real word, or did I learn that from? Okay, I just wasn't sure. I'm like, is that like a West Indian word or something? Sorry. In Scripture, Christ likens our relationship to a wedding and to a marriage. The idea is that we are the bride of Christ, and Christ is that bridegroom. And it's not that I'm a bride, you're a bride, and we're all individual brides, but that we collectively make up this bride that's made ready for Christ in that last day. It's just like how we were talking about in Revelation. And so we as the church ought to share that intimacy and that love, trust relationship with Christ. I don't really get it. I think girls kind of have a bigger grasp of it, or a better grasp of it and such like that. But the interesting thing is that I want to teach you guys something about just reading scripture in general. Is if you read like the letters like James and Peter and Romans and all that stuff, like that's packed with all stuff to learn. But when you read stories in the Bible, the approach is very different. See, the approach in reading stories in the Bible, although you can pick up a lot of good stuff on the way, typically you read the whole story, and the whole story is supposed to teach you one major point. And so, as we read this passage, that's why I'm intentionally not digging into every verse or anything like that, but our approach tonight is to read the whole parable and to understand the main focus point of the whole story. Why did Jesus tell this story? What was his main intention in telling this story? And so the main intention in telling this story is that we need to be ready. We need to be alert, and we need to keep watch. The whole idea is that there are certain things that cannot be left to the last minute. There are certain things, like a relationship with God, that cannot be borrowed from a friend or from your mom or from your dad or anything like that. We are all responsible to be ready. And just like how we had those the virgins who, some of them were ready and some of them weren't, our job is to be diligent and to keep watch. Even when you read the whole passage at the end of it, when he shuts the door, open the door for us. But he replied, I tell you the truth, I do not know you. It says, therefore, keep watch, because you don't know the hour or the day. And so that's the central kind of thing as Christians, especially coming out of Revelation, that we need to be ready for is that coming of Christ. When in Scripture, I'm told that it always says that Christ is coming soon. Christ is coming soon. But I've been told that a more accurate way of translating that is to understand it like suddenly. So we don't know when he's going to come, but when he comes, it's going to be suddenly. And so just like how the announcement came, and in Revelation we read about the trumpets that are played, and Christ comes, and he breaks open the heaven, and the whole earth sees him. In the same way, we had that messenger who was like, the bridegroom is here. And at that point, it's either you're ready or you're not. And this would have been central to the lives of the early Christians, and it remains central to the way we need to live our lives. And so how that takes place is that we need to ready ourselves, and we need to right the relationships that need to be righted. We need to forgive those who need to be forgiven. And even more, well, I don't want to say more importantly, but just as importantly, we need to rid ourselves of sin. And we need to really kind of just man up to the situation and start taking responsibility over it and take it to God in prayer. And to start to deal with those things in our lives and to become ready. And so I know I'm not saying anything deep and huge, something you've never heard before, but it remains very appropriate, especially coming out of Revelation, after we've studied Revelation for such an extensive time. And so now we're on to the second story. And so I'll invite that second group to come up in.
Action. This week on Bible Apprentice, Donald Trump has 3 servants: LaToya Jackson, Lil Jon, Charlie Sheen. What are you doing, Charlie? Winning. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey. Mr. Trump is going to Turks and Caicos, who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one, Charlie Sheen, he gave 5 talents of money. To another, 2 talents. There you go, Mr. John. And to another, he gave 1, Miss Jackson. According to each of their ability. Then he went on his journey. Adios, Mr. Trump. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. Wow. 2, 3, 4, 5. Amazing. So also, the one with 2 talents gained 2 more. Double that. Okay. That's what's up, John. That's what's up. But the man, the Miss LaToya Jackson, who had received the 1 talent, went off. Look at her go. Ooh, go Jackson, go. She dug a hole in the lily. And she planted Mr. Trump's money. That's what's up. After a long, long time, the master of their servants returned and settled his accounts with them. The man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more. I am winning, his master replied. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. That's you, yeah, you. Yeah. The man with 2 talents also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Happiness! Yeah. And then, LaToya Jackson, who had received 1 talent, came. Master, she said.
I went and I hid the money in the lily.
Oh, the master. Oh, here we are. His master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have no scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with bankers, so that when I return, I would have received it back with interest. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And throw that worthless servant LaToya Jackson outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. LaToya Jackson,
You're fired!
That was brilliant. That was gold. So in this story, there's a master and there's 3 slaves. But they're not really slaves as we typically think of it. They're what you call bond servants. And bond servants were basically people who used to be slaves, but because of the great treatment of the master, or the great opportunity, or the friendship, or the allegiance that slave built up, that slave would willingly enter into a relationship with that master to be a slave forever. And it doesn't mean that they were always poor and such. They could own property. They had some sort of freedom to kind of raise their family. They'd be paid. Sometimes they'd be paid well. So it's not typically how we kind of think of slaves. More so kind of like a permanent working relationship. I think that's probably like a good parallel for us to kind of get that. So the master, Quentin, kind of leaves, or Donald Trump, I'm not too sure, kind of leaves on his business trip, or he leaves away for a very long time. And upon his departure, he divvies up his estate and his goods and his assets, and he gives each one of them talents in accordance with how much they can handle. So right off the bat, we learn that when Christ kind of gives us responsibility, he's always giving us in accordance with how much we can handle. So however much he kind of gives you, he entrusts you, and he believes that you can also handle that much, otherwise he wouldn't have given you so much. And to understand a talent, I know we kind of think of talent as like, oh, I'm good at basketball, or I can play whatever. But the idea in ancient history was that a talent was actually a measure of weight. When I was looking around, there's kind of two ways to understand it. The first is that it is 10,000 days' wages. And so when you do the math, someone who makes about $30,000 a year, that works out to about $1,150,000 for one talent. So, and then I saw another one that was 1.5 million, almost 1.5. So, I mean, anyhow you put it, the guy who got 5 talents, that probably would have been like $6 million in today's equivalent. What's my math? The one who got 2 talents would have been 3.5, and then the one who got 1 would have been 1.5. No, 1.25.
1.13.
Whatever. And so we learn from the first slave that as soon as the master left, it says at once he began to put the money out to work. He didn't wait for anything. Instead, like right away, that's the idea is that as soon as, like, I don't know if you guys have ever been in situations where you know an opportunity is coming, and as they're explaining to you this opportunity, you're like, oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could do that. You start to get amped up about it, and you haven't even really been given the task yet. So this is the kind of attitude that this servant kind of has, where literally as soon as he gets the opportunity, he's gone, and he starts putting the money to work. And we learn that he actually doubles the money in the amount in that length of the trip. And we learn that about the second servant too, who was given still a very, very generous amount of responsibility. And he too doubles it. And he's given that same idea where it's at once. As soon as he was given the opportunity, he started working. He didn't wait at all. But it's really that third slave where we really learn the most about this passage, and we learn the most about how we ought to, or how we ought not to act. Actually, the third slave, what's her name? Latoya Jackson. Who is that?
Michael Jackson's sister.
Okay. Latoya Jackson. I don't know, maybe it was like,
She's not well liked.
oh, apparently. I don't know. So, anyway, not that if I don't know maybe not liked or whatever, but whatever. So the third slave, Latoya Jackson, Aisha Martin, played by Aisha Martin, dug a hole in the lily and put her $1 million in a hole. And just kind of hung out or whatever you do with money in a hole. I don't know, like she didn't even go to Dave & Buster's or anything like that. And after a long while, Quentin came back, the master came back to settle accounts. And the idea behind the phrasing there is literally that he came to kind of see how the business went, to kind of call to account everyone and to see how they put the money to work and what they really did with what they were given. And so like we kind of saw from the Wicked skit, I thought that was really cool. The first sisters actually doubled their money, which is pretty crazy. That's some good luck on the stock market or some very strong talent or whatever. But it's the third servant where we really get the like, what were you thinking, man? Like, it just doesn't even make sense. The master condemns him and he says, "You wicked and lazy servant." And so right there we learn what the sin of that third servant was. He was wicked and he was lazy. The master continues to say, "You knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I haven't scattered seed. Well then, you should have at least put my money basically in the bank, and when I came back I would have at least gotten the interest from it." See, God has given us all things. God has given all of us things, and whether it's ability to sing or to play or to dance or to do administration or you have leadership abilities, whatever that ability is, what's important is not what our abilities are, but how we make use of the abilities that God has given us. We aren't judged on what we accomplished on the earth, but rather we're kind of judged on what we did with what we were given here on earth. And if there's one lesson that we learned, if you guys think back to the feeding of the 5,000 where they had 2 fishes and 5 loaves. Last time I messed that up, last time I referenced the 5,000. 2 fishes and 5 loaves. Jesus took 7 items of food and fed 5,000 people. And the lesson is pretty simple, is that when you give God something small, he's able to accomplish really great things with it. And so the question that remains with us is, what are we doing with the things that God has entrusted us with? So we learned that the servant's sin was twofold. First, he was wicked. And that takes on even a deeper meaning he was disobedient because he knew what the master required of him. It wasn't like he didn't know. It wasn't like, oh, what am I going to do with this? Okay, let me just protect it. Like, he wasn't innocent here. He knew what the master required. He's like, I knew that you were hard. I knew that you harvest more than what you sow, and I knew that this is what you wanted, and yet he just decided not to do it. And the reason why he decided was because he was lazy. And so I'm going to kind of bring it to point here, is that we ought not to be lazy with the gifts that we have. We sang a great song today, We Wait Upon the Lord. Strength will rise when we wait upon the Lord. Although I feel like sometimes we wait for the things that we should be doing, and the things that we should be doing, we wait on the Lord, which is just another way of being lazy, really, to be honest. I think sometimes there are so many things in our lives that God is not calling us to do, but commissioning us to do, commanding us to do, and we're waiting. It doesn't really make sense. See, the attitude of these servants was, at once, they got ready to go. I'm told that Paul, when he had his amazing conversion experience, it doesn't really seem like he waited. It seems like he actually went forth and doors got closed. When I applied for, some of you guys know that I applied to go to Japan this year, but that door was closed. And a lot of people were saying, Nick, you should really pray about this. You should really wait on God. You should really wait, and you should really seek him about this, and all of it meaning well, but part of me was thinking, how long do you really have to wait before you decide to feed a hungry person? How long do you really have to wait before you decide that you're going to rebuild someone's house who doesn't have a home? When people are in need, how long do you really have to wait before you take action? See, to me, the way I view it was, God has given me certain gifts, and here's this door to go and serve people. What really do I have to ask myself? Why not just go for it? And I did. And I'm like, you know what? Like, if it closes, it closes. Thus saith the Lord. Like, I'm okay with that. I wasn't hugely disappointed when the door was closed, but I think the attitude that this passage lays out for us is that, what are you waiting for? Get to work at once. Take the talents and abilities that you have and get busy with the things of God. We really need to be about the Master's business. And so when I was studying these passages, it's really interesting. When you read Matthew 24 and 25, they actually go together. The Bible actually wasn't written with chapter 1, chapter 2. It wasn't written with verse 1, verse 2. Those were kind of put in after to help us make sense of the passage. But when you read chapter 24, the disciples and the people are asking Jesus, how will we know when the end times are coming? How will we know when all of history is going to start wrapping itself up? And he starts to give them all of these answers. And I won't regurgitate all of them, but a lot of them are just kind of the chaos of the world that we've read about in Revelation. So that's Matthew 24 if you want to check that out. But the purpose of chapter 25, both the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents, was to teach us how to live in light of the end times. And so the first point is that we need to be ready. And that whole story was built upon to teach us that we need to be ready. And the second one, the parable of the talents, was answering the question, okay, well, how do we be ready? How do we become ready for the coming of Christ? And the answer is exactly as stated. is to take what God has given you and start putting it to work. This is how you ready yourself for Christ's return. And just as a last kind of point and story, how many of you guys were saved either at this church or through a ministry of this church or at an event through this church? I was. How many of you guys? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 of us here. 12, sorry, 13. I see those hands. 13 of us. So 13 of us are a result of people before us who surrendered their gifts and talents to God. In some form or another, Pastor Nick brought his life before God, and he laid down his talents, and he laid down his abilities, and he started putting them to work. And much of this building is a result of, and not entirely of, but a result of Pastor Nick putting his abilities and putting his talents to work. Much of us have a lot to owe to that. And he took what he had and he put it to work, and we are the multiplication of his work, which is really cool, really cool idea. But if you even want the even cooler story, you have to ask Pastor Nick how he got to church in the first place. Pastor Nick was just kind of an average guy or such, and really what brought him to church was someone knocked on his door and invited him. Now, if you're here and you're thinking like, but I don't play music, I don't sing well, I'm not much of a leader, all of these things that you're naming, I don't really fit the criteria. Like, what really do I have to offer? But this lady who invited Pastor Nick to church offered God her feet, her hands, and her mouth. She offered maybe an afternoon of knocking on doors. And yet here we stand as the fruit. All of what you see, all of the people that you see here today is the multiplication of her knocking on a door and inviting a kid to church. And so I want to leave you encouraged. I want to leave you challenged to take what you have, to take your abilities, and to start putting it to work. To take the things that you know you're gifted at, as small as they might seem in your own eyes, and to put them to work. We need to be ready. We need to be busy. There's a lot of work to be done. God can take your bread and your fish and he can feed 5,000 people. The same way he took a knock and an invitation and he saved 13 of us in this room. Do you guys get that? A knock and an invitation and 13 people in this room got saved. Now I know there's a lot in between there, but I hope you guys get the point. And so I'm going to invite the worship team up. And I want to just leave us with that commission. There are times when you need to wait on the Lord. There are a lot of the prayers that were answered in my life, including my academic progress, including a lot of different things came through waiting on the Lord. A lot of the things that he's blessed me with have come by waiting on the Lord. And there are certain things that we need to wait upon the Lord for, but there are certain things where we just need to get up and get busy. There are certain times and certain opportunities where we just need to take what we have and start putting them to work at once. We can't afford to be caught without oil in our lamps. We can't afford to be caught disobedient. We cannot afford to be caught being lazy. We need to just step up and start putting our abilities to action.